On the 21st of July, 2011, the Space Shuttle Atlantis landed at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, having completed its final mission. For the first time in its history, America can no longer put a man into space.
Atlantis, a ghostly silhouette swooping across the end of the runway and touching down to complete a flawless mission, its final flight.
The story of the shuttle is the story of a dream to make space travel affordable with an economic, reusable spacecraft.
Most fantastic day of my entire life was the first day the shuttle lifted off.
In its 30-year career, NASA's flagship has flown more miles, completed more missions, and delivered more hardware than any other space vehicle in history.
When I first saw a space shuttle, I thought there was no way anything this big will ever get off the planet.
The shuttle has helped transform our world, from mobile phones and communication satellites to the humble barcode.
The shuttle really was revolutionary.
But success has come at a tragic cost. 14 astronauts have died on its missions.
You're accepting the reality that you just saw a crew die.
Told by the men and women who built it and flew it, this is the story of a dream to create a reusable spacecraft, and why that dream ultimately failed.
After serving the world for over 30 years, the Space Shuttle has come to a final stop.
Launch day at Cape Canaveral on Florida's Atlantic coast. Thousands of space enthusiasts and patriots descend on the town of Titusville to witness the space shuttle blast into orbit. The shuttle is the most sophisticated and complex vehicle in the world. To defy gravity and get into space, it must survive a controlled explosion of extraordinary proportions.
You're watching those digits flicker off that clock, and you know what's coming. At T-minus 6 seconds, the liquid engines start.
And the noise level, you just can't picture how noisy that is.
At blastoff, 2 rocket boosters ignite, releasing 6 million pounds of thrust.
Liftoff. We have liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia. Liftoff.
Yeah, you get this growling, real high frequency, like that. It just really, really shakes you.
And it looks very slow and gentle as it lifts off. No, it slaps you back in your seat and you lift off at just about 2 times the force of gravity.
8 seconds roll, and the roll program, Houston. Roger, roll discovery. Woo-hoo! 2 and auto.
2 minutes later, the 2 rocket boosters jettison.
Okay, slipped away.
When the engines quit, there's a cheer on the intercom. Everybody just cheers because you have a sense that most of the danger is behind you now.
It takes just 8.5 minutes for the spacecraft and her crew to get into orbit. But 40 years ago, when the shuttle program began, all this was pure fantasy. The world's fascination with space peaked in 1969, when Neil Armstrong first stepped on the moon.
The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The Americans had beaten the Russians in the space race. Astronauts became national heroes.
I wanted to be an astronaut as soon as I heard the word. I was a child of the space race, and I fell in love with everything associated with space, with rockets, with astronomy. Started building homemade rockets and testing them from the deserts. I say homemade rockets, they were actually pipe bombs with fins. Amazing I didn't blow myself to hell and back with these things.
But by the early 70s, the public's excitement for the moon landings was on the wane.
Well, the public is fickle in some ways. So the first lunar landing was a huge event. The nation was behind it. It was part of the Cold War. The United States and the Western civilization is technologically superior. The second moon landing was ho-hum. The third moon landing attempt, nobody paid any attention to.
Putting a man on the moon had cost a staggering $25 billion. But with the race won, the next chapter of space exploration would need to be far cheaper. Since the 1960s, NASA had dreamed of a reusable winged spaceship that would launch into orbit as a rocket, but return to Earth as an aeroplane. They called it the Space Shuttle. The shuttle would be more efficient and more economic than the Apollo rockets that had powered their way to the moon. The shuttle's ambition was closer to home. It was designed to travel in low Earth orbit at altitudes between 200 and 300 miles. The vehicle's purpose would be to exploit space. In its enormous cargo bay, it would carry satellites and scientific equipment. It would be a delivery truck, a motorhome, and a science laboratory in one. But to actually build the shuttle presented an enormous technical challenge.
The design philosophy was to be operated like an airliner. It was a rocket, took off like a rocket. It would fly in space. So that was the concept. It was a great leap in technology to try to do those things.
What made the shuttle revolutionary was its reusability. NASA's vision was to fly the spaceship into orbit once a week. But getting the entire vehicle and its crew back to Earth in one piece would become the engineers' single biggest challenge.
In actuality, it is more difficult than landing on the moon. And probably the biggest technological leap was protecting something that big from the heat of re-entry and be able to reuse that heat shield over and over and over again.
As the shuttle returns from space at hypersonic speeds, it must plow through the dense air molecules of Earth's atmosphere. This creates huge amounts of friction. This friction generates temperatures of 1650 degrees Celsius around the vehicle, hotter than molten lava.
Well, the Space Shuttle is basically constructed like an aircraft. It's made out of aluminum. And aluminum is a wonderful metal to work with for airplanes, but it doesn't do very well at high temperatures. In fact, even at the temperatures you might get in your oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, it begins to soften. The problem with the Space Shuttle, of course, is it's coming back at about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit on the bottom.
Every previous spacecraft had had a heat shield that burned away during re-entry.
We'd re-entered vehicles before with Apollo and Gemini and Mercury, so we knew how to re-enter vehicles into the atmosphere going even higher velocities than the shuttle would. But the reusability of it was the real challenge.
Designing a heat shield that could be used repeatedly became the priority for the engineers. The shuttle couldn't go into space until it was solved. In 1977, as the shuttle was being built, NASA started recruiting pilots to fly their new spaceship.
I was working as a Navy test pilot when I saw the initial announcement that said NASA is wanting to take applications for space shuttle pilots and mission specialists. And I was fascinated by the space shuttle from day one. And I said, I have got to do that.
Astronauts had always been military test pilots, but the shuttle required an entirely new type of space traveler to launch and repair satellites and conduct scientific experiments in orbit. NASA recruited civilians with a broad range of experience, including for the first time, women.
They were people that perhaps more Americans could identify with. You know, there's a doctor up there. There's an engineer up there, not just macho military fighter pilots, test pilots, but people that look like more like ordinary citizens.
I was working at MIT, and so when they said they're looking for some new astronauts to fly on the shuttle, and by the way, we don't just need pilots, we want scientists and engineers, something I'd always dreamed of, and now I had a real shot at it.
The new astronauts started their training to operate the most complex machine ever built.
When you first walked into a simulator and the vast number of switches and the vast number of controls in the cockpit, and you looked around, you kind of had to say to yourself, am I really going to be able to learn how to fly one of these things?
They're there to train you on how to respond to end-of-the-world type disasters. You simulate lifting off, maybe 5 seconds up, one of the liquid engines failed. They're constantly putting in all of these failure modes so that you can learn how to bypass things, how to react, how to use your backups.
We used to affectionately refer to it as death by training.
The engineers constructing the shuttle were desperately searching for a material that would repeatedly protect the ship from the extreme heat of re-entry.
It was a lot of stress. We were working 68 hours a week, all the time, up for a long period of time.
After many failed attempts, Tom Moser and his team finally manufactured an exotic compound of pure silica glass fibers. Silica's chemical composition makes it an extremely poor conductor. It absorbs heat so slowly that during re-entry, it was calculated the shuttle's aluminium skin would remain at safe temperatures of up to 176 degrees Celsius. But the silica had one major disadvantage. It was extremely brittle.
Something as fragile as the silica material that we were using would crack, just like a riverbed cracks when it gets dry. It would crack and you know, wouldn't have any integrity to it. So we decided to pre-crack it, okay? So we sliced it into typically 6-inch by 6-inch sections.
The team made 25,000 6-inch square silica tiles and covered the vehicle with them.
Lo and behold, you got a thermal protection system. So it was that kind of engineering problem that we came up with a, you know, unique solution to it and fixed the problem and didn't add a lot of weight to the vehicle.
At the end of 1980, after nearly a decade in construction, the first reusable spaceship was revealed to the world. A new era of affordable spaceflight beckoned.
When I first saw a space shuttle, I thought there's no way anything this big will ever get off the planet. Everything was gargantuan. And it was also a sense of, this is real. I mean, these things are real.
Big. It was very big. It was big.
To To command the shuttle's maiden flight, NASA picked its most experienced astronaut.
Coming through 3,000 feet, we'll put the speed brakes up.
A man who'd walked on the moon, 50-year-old John Young. To accompany Young, the space agency chose Navy test pilot Bob Crippen.
So it was a truly dynamic duel that they had on board the spacecraft for the first time there. I think it was as great a team as ever been assembled in spaceflight.
Young and Crippen were putting their lives on the line. The shuttle had never been tested in orbit.
We weren't doing unmanned test of this vehicle. The first time you flew it was the first time you flew it, and that is the nature of the shuttle program. High risk, high return.
America's entire space program was now riding on the skills of two men and an untested spaceship.
Landing gear down and locked.
On the 21st of July, 2011, Atlantis touched down safely at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, bringing to an end the Space Shuttle program.
Hurley now deploying the drag chute.
30 years earlier, on the morning of April the 12th, 1981, 500,000 people gathered here to witness the Space Shuttle's very first flight into orbit. The world held its breath. The mood in mission control was serious.
It was very tense. The very first time we flew the shuttle, the whole shuttle system was the first time the whole shuttle stack flew with people on board.
They had tested the main engines on the ground. They had tested the solid boosters on the ground. Everything else was an unknown.
NASA was about to take a huge gamble on the riskiest flight in space history. The Apollo missions had been rehearsed with unmanned test flights, but this wasn't possible with the shuttle. It needed a minimum two-man crew to fly it. The only way to test it was to risk the lives of astronauts John Young and Bob Crippen.
T-minus 12.
At 7 a.m., Columbia was given the command, go for launch.
7.
As they're getting ready to start the engines, they initiate the deluge, and you see these literally tons of water going down into the flame pit.
6, 5, 4. We have a go for main engine start.
And then you see the explosive start of these engines that turns this water into steam.
We have main engine start.
And out of this cloud of steam comes this rocket ship riding a pillar of fire.
America's first space shuttle. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
And then this beast, this creature, just rose very gently. It's saying, let me go. I've been born. I'm ready to fly.
It was like, this is working.
Your heart's pounding at that period of time, but you're also listening to these reports coming in, and you say, hey, it's going pretty doggone well.
Seeing that vehicle lift off was the highlight of my entire career.
Roger on the SEP, Columbia.
Mark, 2 minutes, 20 seconds. Confirm solid rocket booster SEP.
When we finally heard that MECO call, main engine cutoff, when it's basically in orbit, we just were all out of our seats just cheering.
Young and Crippen were now orbiting Earth at a speed of 5 miles every second. It was the dawn of a new era in space travel.
Hey, who's that, John?
Yes, sir.
How you doing?
We're just having a lot of fun up here.
Hey, listen, I'm glad to talk to both you and Cripp. How's he behaving?
I'm trying to behave pretty well, Mr. Vice President.
Well, listen,
Vice President George Bush Sr.'s tribute was beamed around the world.
I think your trip is just going to ignite the excitement and the forward thinking from this country, so I really just wanted to call up and wish you the very best.
Okay, Mr. Vice President. Thank you very much, sir.
But the euphoria was short-lived. 90 minutes into the mission, the crew opened the shuttle's cargo bay doors to release heat generated by the electronics. A camera inside the hold suddenly revealed the engineer's worst nightmare. 16 of the spaceship's revolutionary heat protection tiles were missing from its tail section.
What appears to be 3 tile and some smaller pieces. Roger, Cripp, we can see that good.
If you lose a single tile, you lose the vehicle. Not all 25,000, but there are a lot of, there are thousands which are critical. Lose one on entry and you lose the vehicle.
Mission Control immediately alerted engineer Tom Moser.
Wait, that's 8.5.
That was a 911 call because we thought, oh my God, now we've got a known situation. So I hopped on an airplane, went back to Houston, got with the other engineers.
Moser and his team worked round the clock. They analyzed every frame of footage sent back to them, calculating and recalculating temperatures the shuttle would encounter where the tiles were missing.
We have to recognize that we will have various glitches during the course of a mission, and we have to be prepared to make an assessment as to what are we going to do about it.
Finally, they concluded the spaceship should be able to withstand the heat of re-entry.
Risk is the price of progress. Risk is what we must accept to continue moving forward.
After 54 hours in space, Young and Crippen were cleared to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere with a damaged heat shield. Without having tested the tiles in orbit, the engineers had no idea if their decision to go ahead would be proved right or wrong.
50% quantity, Captain. 66, that sounds better.
For almost 30 heart-stopping minutes, when the tiles were exposed to the most extreme temperatures, Mission Control would have no radio contact with Columbia.
It was an anxious time because as the orbiter comes back through the atmosphere, it ionizes the gas and it blocks out all communications.
No one would know if the crew were alive or dead.
We had nothing to do but sit and wait.
It's almost like you'd been holding your breath for an entire day, and you just suck that air in. And
all those memories of problems with the thermal protection system, problems with the entry flight control system, problems that had been given to us in our training simulations, all of those things that could go wrong could be going on.
Hello, Columbia. Houston's here. How do you read?
Finally, John Young's voice crackled over the static. But one more challenge remained: the final test of the reusable spacecraft. The shuttle now had to land, No other spaceship had ever attempted to touch down on an airstrip. But when landing, it has no engine power to make corrections in flight. The shuttle becomes a 76-ton glider. With the eyes of the world upon him, John Young had just one chance to get it right.
On the final approach.
There it is, they've got 5 miles.
22 seconds
runway ahead of them.
Touchdown. The crew lower the landing gear.
You're coming. You're down.
Okay, Capcom, we're going.
50 feet. 40. 30. 5. 4. 3. 2. 1. Touchdown. 3. Touchdown. Look about, skipper.
After 1,000,000 miles in space, Columbia's wheels kissed the ground.
Welcome home, Columbia. Beautiful, beautiful.
It worked. It worked. I think it actually shocked a lot of us that the engineers were able to pull that off.
Convoy's on its way. Convoy on. Wheel stop on the Columbia. Wheel stop. Roger.
I think John Young and Bob Crippen took the greatest risk in the history of anybody's space program when they flew the shuttle.
And when he came out of the shuttle after landing, he was just bouncing around in that space chute. You know, seeing this man so happy, not that he survived the entry, but the space system and the entire team performed so well.
I was taken back by the emotion that came out, and tears were flowing down my cheeks and all. And I think a lot of people felt that way too. The mission was a success now.
Flight recorders to start.
It had taken nearly a decade to build the world's first reusable spacecraft. But in April 1981, the age of the shuttle had arrived. America was back in space. By the early 80s, the Space Shuttle was ready to go to work.
We have solid rocket booster ignition. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
NASA started building a fleet of new shuttles. There would be 5 in total: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour.
Good roll confirmed by mission control.
We are ready to put the space system to work.
In 1983, British astrophysicist Mike Foale headed to Houston with the dream of swapping his laboratory in Cambridge for one in the Space Shuttle.
This is the full fuselage trainer. It's the shuttle that turned me on to becoming an astronaut.
The shuttle is now Mike's second home. He's launched 6 times and spent over a year of his life in space.
Well, this is the middeck. This is the room in between the flight deck and the floor of the space shuttle where the main nose gear is. This room is where basically the crew lives, sleeps, eats, washes, and also goes to the bathroom. It's a bit like an airliner toilet. It has the obvious place where you sit down. It has handles to hold you down on the toilet. There's a vacuum control. You can break the toilet. If you break the toilet, you are the most unpopular person on the space shuttle for the rest of your flight. And it hasn't happened more than, I think, once. Above us is the flight deck. The gray color of the flight deck reflects very much the heritage of the Space Shuttle. The companies that built the Space Shuttle are now owned by Boeing, and Boeing jets look just like this on the inside. A difference between airliners and the Space Shuttle is that all our switches, specifically, have guards around them. They have metal guards. And they serve two purposes. One is to make sure you hit the correct switch before you throw it. But second, it allows you in zero gravity when you're floating around to hold on to something. If it's a touch screen, like in an airliner, and you touch it, you're going to push yourself off away from the screen. So there are subtle differences between the way a cockpit's laid out for a spacecraft and for an airliner.
With the shuttle now open for business, NASA began securing lucrative contracts from commercial industry. The spaceship was a more effective way to deploy satellites. It has revolutionized the world of communications, from global tracking systems to mobile phones. For the first time in its history, NASA had a spacecraft generating a revenue stream.
Basically, we had moved into an entirely new era of technology that could be exploited by commercial enterprises.
The Space Shuttle was to exploit, not to explore space.
And the shuttle could do something that had never been possible before. Using its 15-meter-long robotic arm, it could retrieve, repair, and upgrade satellites.
What we did with the shuttle was really what you would call going to work in space. Putting satellites out, dropping them off, and sending them up to other orbits, retrieving satellites, repairing satellites.
Pretty blue-collar work, but we didn't care. I mean, none of us cared what we were doing as long as it put us in space.
The shuttle's heavy workload meant astronauts were spending more time in space than ever before. And there was an incredible perk to the job.
I would stay up late on my shuttle missions so I could have an opportunity to look out the window. And I would tell my crew, you have to do this before we deorbit and land, because if you don't take some time to look out the window, then you're missing one of the most, to me, the most important things on the human side of flying in space is looking down on the planet.
The sunrises and sunsets are just fascinating to watch because they're happening 16 times as fast as they happen down here on the Earth. Because you go around the Earth every 90 minutes. So you're going to be 45 minutes in the daylight, 45 minutes in the dark, 45 minutes in the daylight. So the sun goes up and down 16 times a day.
I know from my first flight, I spent so much time looking out the window that I only slept maybe 4 hours a night, and after a couple of days, you can't keep going like that.
On each mission, the shuttle's new breed of astronauts would conduct unique scientific experiments, from analyzing the effects of bone decay in zero gravity to documenting cloud structures and the distribution of ozone.
On 2 of my 3 flights, we did very sophisticated science. There's certain things that happen in your body because of gravity that we didn't know before, because we've never been in a place where there wasn't gravity acting on us in some way.
So you look in your checklist and it'll say at mission elapsed time, 1 day, 6 hours, 10 minutes, you turn on this experiment. So it's all choreographed to the second.
What are the things about gravity that affect how a tree grows? Cells grow in 3 dimensions in weightlessness, which is awesome to think you could grow organs or learn more about cancer from the 3 dimensions.
The shuttle's extraordinary versatility was making headlines, and the public fell in love with space. once again.
Space shuttles made their way into everything. They made their way onto clothing. They made their way into toys. You had all kinds of space shuttle toys. And it literally became the symbol of the American space program.
Despite its achievements, the shuttle was failing to meet its original target of 50 flights a year. The task of servicing the spaceship so it could return to orbit was proving far more time-consuming and costly than had been anticipated.
The message came down from Washington that we had to turn the shuttle around in 2 weeks, and so that's what we said we could do. We didn't have a clue. I mean, we didn't know how to reuse a system. We didn't know what was going to be required.
The shuttle has 2.5 million individual components. 5,000 of them are critical. If any one failed, it would result in the total loss of the vehicle. To ensure the safety of each mission, every tile, circuit breaker and valve needs inspecting, repairing, or replacing.
When you're crawling around the orbiter processing facility at Kennedy Space Center, and you see, hundreds or maybe even thousands of people that are required to get the shuttle ready for flight, then it really sinks in what a complex vehicle this is.
The shuttle had revealed its weakness. The task of returning to flight was too intricate, and the pressure to launch would soon lead to tragedy.
We were not approaching spaceflight, we were not approaching shuttle launches with the same degree of rigor and the same degree of conservatism that we had in, let's say, the first 6 launches. And when we let our guard down, that's when we suffered the loss of Challenger.
Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up.
The Space Shuttle Challenger was scheduled to lift off on the 28th of January, 1986. But the night before launch, temperatures in Florida plummeted to minus 13 degrees Celsius, and great shards of ice formed on the launch pad. There was concern for the safety of the heat protection tiles.
I got a call that night from the program manager, and he said that there was a situation which was concerning, and he wanted to make sure that everything was okay, or should we scrub the mission? One of the concerns was the ice would hit the tiles and damage them. So we formed a team that night, and we convinced ourselves that we were safe for flight. So I reported back to the program manager that we were go for flight.
But this flight was different from any other. Among Challenger's astronauts was a member of the public, 37-year-old schoolteacher and mother of 2, Krista McAuliffe.
And pilot Mike Smith, followed by Krista McAuliffe, teacher in space. Big smiles today.
Krista McAuliffe had been chosen from 11,000 teachers for a White House initiative designed to encourage children to take an interest in the tough subjects of science and engineering.
The idea that you could take someone, a non-professional astronaut, a teacher, a newsman, and fly them seemed to us to be a little bit premature. So as it came around to that and we saw the publicity, I think many of us said, this isn't all bad, because if it helps us sustain the Space Shuttle program with support through the Congress and the public, then that's good. Let's just hope it's safe enough.
Are you feeling any apprehension at all about going up into space?
Well, not right now, but I really don't think the whole thing has hit me.
The 28th of January, 1986, launch day.
This is shuttle launch control at T-minus 2 hours, 28 minutes and counting. Here comes the 51L flight crew, ready to depart the O&C building for the launch pad.
As the 7 crew members made their way to the shuttle, temperatures on the pad were still barely above freezing.
T-minus 7 minutes and counting.
School kids in Krista's hometown of Concord, New Hampshire, tuned in to watch the historic occasion.
T-minus 15 seconds.
At 11:29 a.m., the command, go for launch, was given.
7, 6, we have main engine start, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
As Challenger left Earth, communications were transferred from launch control in Florida to mission control in Houston.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Astronaut Dick Covey was in charge of communicating with Challenger that day.
As we watched and the launch progressed, throttle down was as expected. Not any big deal there.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells. 65, Fido. TDL confirms throttles. Thank you.
I made the call, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up. It's a standard call. Everything, also, the absence of anything else says everything looks normal to us.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Roger, go at throttle up. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
When I looked up at the monitor, I could not tell what I was looking at. I hadn't seen the explosion. All I saw was this fireball, clearly a fireball. And I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't make any sense. I looked back down, all of the data on my panel had gone to missing.
Fido trajectory. Go ahead.
Flight GC, we've had negative contact, lost downlink.
Okay, everybody, stay off the telephones. Make sure you maintain all your data. Start pulling it together. Awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field.
The disaster unfolded live on television.
Reports from the flight dynamics officer indicate that the vehicle apparently exploded and that impact in the water. Flight Fido. Go ahead. RSO reports vehicle exploded. Copy.
That's when I realized that the emotional part of it really hit me then. Because then we were beyond work. We were beyond our training. We had run the gamut of even ideas of what we might do. Now we were in an accident recovery situation. Now, that's hard to do when you're accepting the reality that you just saw a crew die.
Very few accidents are captured live. You generally see the after effect of an explosion or a fire or whatever it is. It was an extremely difficult morning.
We didn't dwell really on the risks involved, at least at that point, because we had never lost anybody in space. And I think we We couldn't envision that anything would happen. Perhaps we were in denial.
We were naive to that degree. We were innocent to a certain degree. And Challenger was the end of that innocence.
Immediately following the disaster, all shuttle flights were grounded, and one of the most intense and thorough investigations in history began.
I know, Mr. Kilminster, you signed the document that went to NASA to launch, but in a sense,
a low temperature increases the chance of a joint failure.
it was like a committee decision. There was no one person that was responsible.
Yes, sir.
After 4 months, the Presidential Commission published their report. It revealed that the loss of 7 astronauts and the $2 billion spacecraft had been caused by a simple pair of rubber O-rings on the solid rocket boosters.
This tragic accident was a result of the failure of that joint on the right aft booster rocket.
The rocket boosters are made up of 6 cylindrical segments stacked on top of each other. At each joint, between the segments, a pair of rubber O-rings, a primary and backup, make an airtight seal inside the joint. On the day of Challenger's launch, the boosters ignited, firing a flame down the center of each rocket. In a split second, an explosive force caused the steel casing to expand outwards. But because of the freezing temperatures that morning, the rubber O-rings had hardened and failed to seal the joint properly. Superheated rocket fuel escaped with catastrophic effect. But what was also shocking was the Commission discovered O-rings had failed on previous launches, and NASA had known about it all along. Disaster had only been prevented because the backup ring held.
What shocked us was it was a predictable failure, that there was a long history of problems with the O-rings. That was shocking.
The loss of Challenger's 7 crew members was the first time in American space history that astronauts had died in flight.
This is going to be a safe thing, and all of a sudden, pow, it is in your face. It is not safe. It's dangerous. It can be deadly. And that was a real shock. I think it was a shock because everybody expected it to be perfectly safe. Those of us that worked in the industry knew that was not true, but we didn't talk about it a lot.
The future of NASA's space program now hung in the balance. Would the shuttle ever fly again? Following the Challenger disaster in 1986, the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center in Florida lay deserted. All shuttle flights were grounded. NASA spent the next 2 years on a $1.4 billion overhaul of their spacecraft, making over 200 modifications.
It was extremely important that NASA find a way to fly again as soon as possible. Waiting to fly again risked the whole program. In fact, it could risk the agency.
Finally, in 1988, the shuttle made its way back to the launch pad. But the ambition of an affordable, fast turnaround spacecraft was proving ever more elusive. Contracts from the telecommunications companies dried up. Satellites were now launched on conventional rockets. The shuttle needed to find a new purpose urgently. The Hubble telescope would prove to be its savior. One of science's most cherished dreams was to build a giant orbiting telescope to answer the question, how old is our universe?
Oh, when you saw it, it was mind-boggling, because I remember the first time I saw it, it was sitting in the vertical. It was gigantic.
Big is better. Telescopes, big is better.
Hubble had taken 10 years to build, but in 1990 it was finally ready to be launched into space. The only way of getting it there was on board the shuttle. The telescope promised to capture faint light that had traveled billions of years across the universe. To get it to its optimum altitude of 380 miles, the shuttle would go further than it had ever gone before.
GPS, go. Eagle, go.
If the spaceship's fuel systems failed this far from Earth, the astronauts would be unable to return home.
GC, go. Network, go. Okay, Capcom, we have a go for release.
Discovery, go for Hubble release.
With Hubble deployed, the telescope's 2 vast mirrors can open a window on the heavens with unprecedented clarity. Light entering Hubble bounces off its primary mirror onto a secondary mirror that reflects the light back to a focal point where it's captured for analysis. The world eagerly anticipated the arrival of Hubble's first photographs. But when the images were beamed back, they were blurred. Hubble's primary optical mirror had been ground to the wrong dimensions. A 50th of the width of a human hair was all it took to make the telescope short-sighted. It was a humiliating disaster for NASA. Its reputation was damaged, and the entire shuttle program was at risk again.
That hits you pretty hard when you know that you played a personal role in putting that telescope up there.
The only way to salvage the situation was to send the shuttle back to fix Hubble. But it would require the most complex repair mission in the history of space exploration.
You know, to be on that Hubble rescue mission was a real plum from an astronaut's point of view. It's gotta be.
The astronauts trained for 11 months, simulating the weightlessness of space in NASA's vast water tank.
As a spacewalker, I need the right moves. If you're putting a motherboard in a computer, if you're putting memory chips in, if you're doing this or that, it's the moves you make that'll guarantee the outcome. We were at it 16 hours a day.
There wasn't going to be anything that we could have done to prepare for the mission that didn't get done.
By December 1993, they were ready. But many inside NASA doubted the success of the mission.
NASA headquarters had no faith that we were going to pull it off.
We had a tight timeline. We had to get to the telescope. We had to capture it. We had to start getting guys out the door the next day.
It took 3 days for the shuttle to reach the stricken telescope. After carefully maneuvering the spaceship into position, its remotely controlled robotic arm reached out and plucked Hubble out of space.
Rigid eyes, Space Telescope captured.
Houston, Endeavour has a firm handshake with Mr. Hubble's telescope.
There was relief all round.
We copy that, Cubby, and there are smiles galore down here.
It's quite a sight.
Great work up there, you guys.
The crew had to attempt 5 dangerous spacewalks back to back. It had never been done before. Correcting Hubble's faulty mirror was relatively straightforward, but another part of the operation proved more complicated. The astronauts had to replace 4 of the 6 gyroscopes that helped keep Hubble stable whilst in orbit. They were located deep inside the telescope.
To get access to them, you gotta reach way back in there. So I came up with this procedure in which I would get into the work position. It's so tight in there.
if one of us could actually slide in underneath the gyroscopes, we could get the job done much faster.
So I had my buddy Jeff grab me by the feet, and he fed me up inside the telescope.
I held on to Story, positioned him properly, and then he sort of locked himself in place, and we went through the replacement one after the other, and they all worked. So we felt really good.
All that was left to do was to close Hubble's doors and get back into the shuttle.
I went to shut the door and close the latch, and it didn't latch properly. And so I opened it again and, closed it, didn't latch. And that's when I thought to myself, oh boy.
It's not closing, the doors aren't closing right. Let's try to get the bottom. Let me get the bottom coming in before you close that door.
I can't figure out why the doors won't close.
Unless the doors were securely fastened, the extreme cold would destroy the telescope's fragile components. Hubble would become a billion-dollar piece of space junk.
And we finally came up with the idea of making an unusual use of one of our ratchet devices. The movers use them to hold down furniture inside moving vans.
After nearly 2 hours carefully manipulating the doors, they finally got them closed.
We held the doors together in alignment, and with 2 fingers I moved to come along, and it pulled them together, so we had it.
We got the door closed.
Good work, guys.
After a grueling 10 days in orbit, the crew was able to report mission accomplished, to the intense relief of NASA's management.
And we have to say that through your superb efforts, you have really shown that NASA can do all that we promised to do and more, and we very much appreciate it.
We had succeeded beyond anybody's wildest dreams. I mean, everything that we had set out to do, we had done successfully.
Since its repair, the Hubble telescope has photographed black holes, dust storms, and melting ice caps on Mars. It's seen stars being born and dying, and measured the rate at which the universe is expanding.
It has rewritten the books on physics, astronomy, and cosmology.
It has given such pleasure to so many people who had no idea of the beauties that are out there in the universe.
The Hubble rescue mission showcased the shuttle's unique abilities to retrieve and repair large structures in space. This versatility had originally been conceived for a much larger and more ambitious project, one that had always been deemed unaffordable, until now. In 1993, the US Congress approved the billions of dollars needed to construct a permanently manned space station in orbit.
The International Space Station is the largest international engineering project ever attempted in the history of mankind, both in terms of scale, money, people involved, anything you want to talk about.
It would be a living, working environment in space that could only be constructed using the shuttle. Finally, the spacecraft was going to do what it had been designed for.
The Space Shuttle and a space station were seen as companion ventures to establish that permanent presence in space.
The money was in place, and by the early 90s, so were the politics. Cold War relations between Russia and America that had started the space race had now warmed. The space station would be a joint venture, marking a new era of international cooperation. NASA sent its astronauts to collaborate with their old adversaries.
Russia was the Soviet Union. They were our Cold War enemies. And come the 1990s, I'm training with Russians. I'm going to Russia. I'm in their mission control. I'm in Star City. I'm speaking in Russian. I never thought that this would happen.
the shuttle's astronauts had a new role, this time as the world's most highly trained construction workers on the most prestigious building project of all time.
The Russians didn't have the big hauling capability of the space shuttle and the ability to send a large crew up to do a lot of the intricate work.
Over 13 years, they flew more than 30 missions, hauling essential parts into space and assembling the station piece by piece.
The shuttle could carry the modules that were the size of interstate buses and could carry 6 or 7 person crews to do that construction work in orbit. And then once the space station was established, to continue bringing tons of supplies at a time. So it really enabled a rather efficient assembly of a space station.
The crew requests permission to come aboard. Endeavor, permission granted.
The International Space Station has now been permanently manned for more than 10 years. In that time, the shuttle has carried scientists and engineers from 16 nations to work together in zero gravity. They've completed groundbreaking science, developing vaccines and new ways to kill airborne pathogens, and improved our understanding of man-made disasters on Earth. By the turn of the new millennium, the shuttle's reputation as the world's most successful space program seemed secure. February the 1st, 2003. The crew of the space shuttle Columbia were on a routine mission. Columbia was the oldest shuttle in the fleet, and the first to launch into orbit more than 20 years earlier. This was its 28th flight. The crew was made up of 7 men and women with a diverse range of skills. 4 of them were on their first mission into space. They had spent 16 days conducting scientific experiments and were due to head home. But no one on board was aware that the shuttle had sustained a massive breach in its heat shield. The leading edge of the left wing had a gaping hole in it. As the crew started their descent towards Earth, everything was going to plan.
This is amazing. It's really getting really bright out there. Yeah, you definitely don't want to be outside now.
We operate so close to these hazards that we have to experience in all of our missions. We have to be almost perfect. You know, really good isn't good enough.
But 10 minutes after Columbia re-entered the atmosphere, Mission Control noticed 4 temperature sensors in the left wing had failed.
4 hide return temps.
To the left outboard and left inboard L1.
Where is that instrumentation located?
All 4 are located in the aft part of the left wing.
Instrument malfunction during re-entry was not uncommon.
Everything looked good to you? Control and rates and everything is nominal, right?
Done so far, flight. We have good trims. I don't see anything out of the ordinary.
Okay.
All other readings appeared normal. But minutes later, more sensors failed.
And flight econ?
Econ.
I've got 4 temperature sensors on the bond line data that are off scale low.
In Columbia, Houston, we see your...
Suddenly, Shuttle Commander Rick Husband's words cut out mid-sentence.
Flight max are also off. Roger. Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check. Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check. Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
Flight final.
Within minutes, a TV network in Dallas was broadcasting amateur footage that appeared to show the spacecraft leaving an unusual cluster of bright lights in its wake.
GC flight. GC flight. Flight GC, lock the doors. Copy. No phone calls, off-site, no data, no phone calls, no transmissions anywhere into or out.
At 9 o'clock this morning, Mission Control in Houston lost contact with our Space Shuttle Columbia. A short time later, debris was seen falling from the skies above Texas. The Columbia is lost. There are no survivors.
17 years after the Challenger disaster, the world was once again in shock, bewildered by another seemingly inexplicable catastrophe. The investigation into the accident discovered the damage to the shuttle's heat shield had occurred during launch. A piece of foam, the size of a briefcase, had broken loose from the external fuel tank and blown a hole in the left wing. The investigation also revealed that just 24 hours into the mission, NASA engineers had reviewed film of the launch and noticed the foam strike. They reported it to their superiors, but they failed to act on the information. Once again, NASA's management and their decision-making processes were under fire.
The public reaction to Columbia was they were astounded that NASA had screwed up again.
The Columbia disaster confirmed beyond doubt that space travel on board the shuttle was dangerous and unpredictable. But this time, there would be no reprieve. President Bush announced that once it had served its purpose building the space station, the shuttle would be retired.
The Columbia accident convinced me, and I think many other people, that it was time to retire the shuttle. You know, the shuttle is aging. It is high risk. Been 2 accidents and, you know, a little over 100 flights. That's not very good odds.
NASA's dream of a reusable, affordable spacecraft was over. By 2010, the shuttle program had cost the American taxpayer a staggering $209 billion.
It sounds like a no-brainer that reusing a spacecraft would make it cheaper. As it turned out, the reusability feature made it more expensive because after it lands, you have all of these thousands of systems and lines that have to be tested and pressurized and drained and checked. It turned out to be much more difficult than anybody ever anticipated.
On the 21st of July, 2011, the shuttle landed at the Kennedy Space Center for the very last time.
7 a.m. Central Time, 5:57 a.m. Eastern Time.
In total, the spacecraft has flown 135 times, an average of just 5 missions a year.
Its final flight, 13-day mission to fortify the International Space Station.
The Space Shuttle's last flight ushers in a period of uncertainty in America's space program. For the first time in NASA's history, it must rely upon Russian rockets to get astronauts into space.
I think it's criminal that we have to go to the Russians to buy our way into space. I think that is just, I mean, to imagine this country is the foremost spacefaring country in the world, and now what are we doing? We're buying rides on a Russian rocket. I'm just severely disappointed in that situation.
Today, America's ambitions in space are changing. Future exploration is now focused on deep space. And this time, it's not just the Russians America will be in competition with.
If China gets to the asteroids and to Mars before us, if China goes back to the moon and starts mining the resources there, if India does this, if Russia does this, they're going to leave us behind. We were behind once before, and I think we may be back in that situation again, that another country will wake us up and get us moving. And good for them. I wish them the best.
The Space Shuttle, the world's first reusable spacecraft, has earned its hallowed place in history.
The shuttle is an extraordinary engineering achievement, a high watermark, an eighth wonder of the world, if you will.
It was 30 good years of doing a whole bunch of stuff.
It really rewrote the book on space.